This is Father Steve at the Mission Anglican Church in Pensacola, Florida, and I am going to be discussing for our series on the 2019 Book of Common Prayer, the Preface. So this preface here is, it just lays out the context for the Book of Common Prayer, why we have it, where it comes from, and it starts off talking about the earliest Anglicans. So Christianity came to England very early. There's even legends that maybe Joseph of Arimathea went there, or any of the apostles, or there's even a legend that Jesus went there when he was a young boy. I don't know anything about all that. Those are just speculations. But we do know that Britain was a colony of the Roman Empire. We know that the Roman Empire was sending soldiers there, and so there were sailors, merchants, missionaries. So people were coming to Britain very early on, and some of those, like I said, were missionaries. They were converts to Christianity in the first century. They were the first Christians. They had believed in Jesus Christ, and so they came to Britain, and they were doing business there, or maybe moving there and living there. And those were the first Christians. So Christianity came to Europe. It came to Britain within the first century. We know that by the second century, there's already the church fathers are writing about the church. Second, third century, they're already writing about the church in Britain. So we know that they must have come there in the first century, and we're already doing mission work. So some of the earliest Christian missionaries to the British Isles worked within a pagan culture. That pagan culture, you hear about the Druids, you hear about the different Norse pagan groups that lived in that area. So there was a lot of tribal paganism all over the British Isles. Christianity was the minority, and so they were doing mission work, and a lot of them worked within monastic communities. So they would live together for safety, and they would have a common life together. They would work together, they would pray together. And this is the time period where you hear about people like St. Patrick in the 4th century, Brigid, David, Columba, Cuthbert, Hilda. You have all these basically abbots, abbotesses, and even bishops who are coming to Britain very early on and starting to do mission work. And so this early Christianity in Britain was not the organized diocesan level with bishops, priests, deacons, organized that way. It was much more monastic. So you'd have abbots, abbotesses, these monastic communities all living together, surrounded by pagan society. So it wasn't the organized Christianity that we think of when we think of kind of medieval Europe, right? And then what happens after that is in the 6th century, we have Augustine, or some people call him Augustine, some people call him Augustine of Canterbury. He was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, who came from Rome as a Benedictine monk. He was sent by Pope Gregory to come there and to do mission work and to bring more uniformity within the church there, to bring more unity with the church in Britain and the church in Rome. And so the Church of Rome at this point was becoming more and more kind of the patriarchate in the Western church. And so they were starting to kind of assert dominance really over all the other churches and trying to kind of create uniformity amongst the churches. And so we really see this in the 6th, 7th century. The Church of Rome starts to create a uniformity. So, for example, in England, they were worshiping on a different day for Easter. They had different traditions for how they would cut their hair, and tonsures is what they call it. So there's just different things that they would do. And so the Roman church said, hey, we're going to bring more uniformity here. And so the Norman conquest of the 11th century also played a role in diminishing and diminishing the distinguishing particularities of the Ecclesia Anglicana, so the Church of England. And liturgy also became increasingly complicated and clericalized. So the Norman Conquest, obviously they came from France, and so you have this kind of Catholic uniformity again. And then for basically throughout the 11th, first 1500 years of the church, you have this first 600 years of early Christianity and mission work and Roman colonies and everything going on in Britain. And then in the 6th century, you have the Church of Rome coming there and creating more uniformity. And so Christians in Britain became much more like Christians across the Roman Empire, across the Western Church. So there's much more uniformity. And then what happens in the 16th century, so up until that point, you have the Roman Catholic Church and the primitive church in England, and then you have the Reformation happen. So in the 16th century, people know about Luther and Wittenberg and the 95 Theses, and 1517 was when he put the 95 Theses on the church there. So you have Reformation happening in Europe in the 16th century, and by this point, things are becoming more global and more national as well. And so kingdoms really are not living in vacuums. I mean, they're sending people back and forth. There's a lot of trade happening, a lot of sharing of knowledge. Erasmus was a very important academic during right before Luther. You have a lot of academic work happening between different scholars of that time. And so people in England are reading Luther's work from Germany. And so you have this place called the White Horse Inn. People call it Little Germany. So people are starting to read what's going on in the continent, and some of them are becoming kind of closet Lutherans. I mean, they're starting to agree with a lot of what Luther is saying and some of these reformers on the continent. Well, King Henry VIII, around this time period, he was the King of England, and Archbishop Cranmer was appointed as the Archbishop of England. Henry didn't really want Reformation happening in England like he saw on the continent, and understandably. The continent was it was pretty chaotic. There was a lot of rebellion and fighting and war. And so King Henry, with all of his different problems, he was pretty wise in trying to keep Reformation more organized and less chaotic in England. And so he did decide to separate from the church in Rome, and partly because he wanted to have his marriage annulled and get remarried, but also he saw the value of separating his kingdom from the Roman Church. So, saying that, he was called a defender of the faith. He was actually given that title by Rome because he had written this defense of the seven sacraments. And so the Church of Rome, the Pope, was actually pretty impressed with King Henry's work and decided to give him that title, defender of the faith. So King Henry, he really wanted to keep a Catholic tradition, a Catholic church, just without the Pope. Cranmer wanted to create more change, but Cranmer was also, pretty wise and careful in how he did that. So he didn't create a lot of change right away. He bided his time. He worked with the king. The king really trusted Cranmer. And eventually, toward the end of King Henry's life, more change was happening. And then Edward VI, King Henry's son, ends up taking the throne. And this is when Cranmer is able to have a lot more freedom, and Reformation leaders start to create more change in England. So the 1549 prayer book is released as the first prayer book. there's actually a lot of uh, tension about this, obviously, because not everybody in England really wanted to have a strong Reformed church. A lot of them still consider themselves to be Catholic, even Roman Catholic, and they didn't really appreciate Cranmer coming along and changing the prayer book. And so it was not clean and as uniform of a change as I think Cranmer would have hoped for. But change was happening, and the 1549 prayer book comes out, and it's really kind of the big benchmark, the big change of worship in England. Because before that, worship was done in Latin for the most part. So it was Latin liturgies. People know it as the Sarum Rite, which has actually many different liturgies, different rites that were written and used throughout England. Cranmer took all of those and created a more reformed prayer book that was used across England, and the theology in it was biblical. It was trying to bring it back to the more primitive church. So Cranmer was reading the church fathers and trying to create worship that was biblical and more simplified, and removing some of the excesses and superstitions that he saw within the Latin worship of the time. So the other thing that happens is monasteries are removed by the king. So all these monasteries are shut down, and that's a big change for England, because before that, a lot of times people saw the monasteries as the place of prayer. But Cranmer works hard to create a change so that the family and the local congregations become the place where prayer is happening. So no longer are the monks the chief prayer warriors, right? Now it's the congregations and the families that are the focus of Cranmer for prayer. So for about a century, the Church of England is independent, and it broadens its horizons as a denomination. They're their own tradition now, separate from the Church of Rome. And so within that, you have a lot of academic and poets and stuff like that. This period has the Caroline Divines. So Jeremy Taylor, Lancelot Andrewes, Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, and George Herbert are some of the names that are listed in the preface of the prayer book here. These guys were wonderful, wonderful poets, academics, scholars who really created this blossoming of Anglican theology, literature, and scholarship, and worship. Music blossoms. So you have this kind of the golden age of the Anglican time period, and a lot of people look at the Caroline Divines as the true theologians of Anglicanism. And the English Civil War of the 17th century drove the Church of England and her liturgy underground. So you have this Puritanism and a shift away from bishops, priests, deacons, and the structures that the Puritans saw as being too Romish and too much like the Church of Rome. So the liturgy has to go underground. And so for a time period, England is basically made almost like Geneva, or it's Puritanized, essentially. And this is under Cromwell. And during that period, you don't see you don't see the Anglicanism that a lot of people think of with bishops, priests, deacons, and the liturgy we have. It's much more Protestant, Puritan, almost Presbyterian. But the restoration of the monarchy takes place after this period, and a new prayer book is authorized, the 1662, which is the authorized prayer book. Parliament authorizes it, and it becomes the sine qua non of the church's liturgy, and basically it becomes the prayer book that is used. This prayer book is the prayer book that goes all over the world, and so wherever the church goes, the prayer book went with it. And so even in Africa, they're using the 1662. all over the world. And eventually, what happens in the 18th century, you have the Great Awakening, the Methodist movement. And then in the 19th century, you have Anglo-Catholicism starts. And so 18th and 19th centuries, you really see the diversity of Anglicanism happening. There's a shift where now you have a lot of evangelicals and you have Anglo-Catholics. And so this is kind of like where broad tent Anglicanism emerges, is during this time period. This is also a time period where there's a lot of scholarship with patristics. There's a lot of work for ecumenical movement with the Church of Rome and with the Eastern Orthodox. And so there's a lot of work. It's a rapprochement ecumenical period. And so the 79 Prayer Book is an example of what happened when that took place. So it's really kind of a shift from particular Reformed theology to a more ecumenical theology, and especially in the United States and other places, there's a real movement of Anglicans to be more ecumenical and to be more like the universal church and less particularly Anglican, I guess, which some Anglicans today still kick against, and I understand why. Because it is important that we remember our Reformation heritage, remember the Reformed teaching, but at the same time, we also go ad fontes. We go back to the sources as Anglicans, and so there's always this, we are Reformed, but we're also patristic. We're also trying to be connected with the early church and with the first few hundred years of the church, and we are trying to be ecumenical in some ways. So Anglicanism is a challenge because we are ecumenical. We are trying to be in communion with one another. We are trying to work together with other groups like the Roman Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, the Lutherans, and we are trying to kind of do ministry together with those groups. This is also, it's helpful in some ways because with that, a lot of evangelical movement and Protestantism, Anglicanism in some places kind of slips into this. Here it says, baptismal theology, especially in North America, was affected by radical revisions to the received Christian understanding and came perilously close to proclaiming a gospel of individual affirmation rather than a personal transformation and sanctification. And so there's, within this, Anglicanism starts to look a lot like Protestantism in America or evangelicalism in America. And so this kind of evangelical push towards baptism is simply me affirming that I'm a believer and therefore I'm able to be baptized. There's a shift away from what is God doing in baptism. God is the one who, it washes us, and he's the one that baptizes us, and it is his work in baptism that sanctifies us. And so this is an important thing that Anglicans need to understand is, our baptismal theology, our sacramentology, the way we think about sacraments is patristic. It's early church, and the way we read the Bible is that way as well. So then we have in the 21st century, there's global reassessment of the Book of Common Prayer of 1662 as a standard of doctrine, discipline, and worship, and this shapes the present volume. So this book of the 2019 Book of Common Prayer does take seriously the 1662, but it also is, looking at patristics. It's looking at the prayer books before it. So there is this connection between the 2019 and the 1662, but as well, it's looking at the 79 prayer book. The Psalter of 1535, the Coverdale Psalter, is used in this prayer book, which is super cool. T.S. Eliot's scholarship and C.S. Lewis's scholarship is used in the Psalter. So the Book of Psalms in this prayer book uses those scholars and theologians. The 2019 Book of Common Prayer says here is indisputably true to Cranmer's original vision of of a form of prayer and praise that is thoroughly biblical, Catholic, in the manner of early centuries, highly participatory in delivery. So this prayer book focuses on still being biblical. Like, we try not to do anything that would conflict with Scripture. It's also Catholic in trying to look at the wider church and the wider traditions of churches around us, to learn from them, and to go back to the sources, to see what did the early church believe. It's also highly participatory in delivery, so we want the congregation to be praying with the clergy and not just attending the service, but participating in the service. It's peculiarly Anglican and English in its roots, so it looks, like I said, back at the 1662 and the prayer books before it, to use some of that robust Reformed theology, taking sin very seriously, taking penitence, being penitential, very seriously. It's also culturally adaptive, so the language in this prayer book is trying to reach North Americans today. And so it's written in a way that somebody can pick it up and still understand it for the most part. There may be theology in it, theological words that they're going to have to learn, but it's written in modern English. It's written so that we can use it in parishes all over North America. And it's utterly accessible to the people. And I like the lectionary in here. I think it's straightforward, it's easy to use. So if you want to do your daily prayers out of here, you can find the readings pretty quickly. You can find the collects, so the prayers for each day or each week are easy to find in here. And it's also, I think it's a great prayer book for catechism and forming the congregation. And that's also one of the things that the preface notes, is that this is really for forming the congregation. So in 2008, the Jerusalem Declaration was published, and it located itself within the historic confines of what is authentically the Christian faith and the Anglican patrimony. And so this prayer book is also written in conformity with what the Jerusalem Declaration wrote down as conservative, Bible-believing, historic Anglicans came together. Most of them from Africa came together at the Jerusalem Declaration and published that. This prayer book is also meant to be in conformity with that. So I hope this video is helpful. That's a lot of information, I know, but this is the preface to the prayer book. It gives you kind of a short history of the early church in England and kind of what happened, why the prayer book was created, and why we have it today. So if you have questions or ideas, please comment, and as always, subscribe, like, and I hope you join me for my next video. God bless.